Hi everybody, Dan Ball here, and if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know I am indeed a knothead. I'm just coming off the build of probably my physically largest project ever, and this time I want to try something a little bit different with my video. I'm actually going to do a full series on the build, so this is going to be multi-part, and this is going to be part one. It's going to start from rough lumber and go to the finished product. So I hope you enjoy it. What the build is a display cabinet I put together for my friends Pete and Kim. I started off by actually designing it, and I put that together in SketchUp. I'm not going to try and do a SketchUp tutorial because I'm still pretty rough as far as how everything works. So if you want a SketchUp tutorial, I would suggest checking out Jay Bates. He has some really great SketchUp videos over on his channel at Jay's Custom Creations. But I started off with the design and I emailed it to Kim and got her approval, and she chose Knotty Pine as the lumber. Once it had been decided on what kind of lumber I was going to be using to build this cabinet, I headed for the lumber yard and picked up a few board feet of knotty pine. What's a board foot? Yeah, those of you who have been to the lumber yard a few times, have a little experience woodworking, you may want to tune out now. But what a board foot is, for you beginners, is it's a unit of volume. Okay, and it's the volume of a board that's 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. So how do you calculate that over a board that might be 6 inches wide? Well, there is actually a formula. It's pretty simple. You take your thickness, whether it be 1 inch, 5/4. Lumber at the lumber yard sold in quarters of an inch, so 5/4 is 1 1/4 inches, and you multiply that by your width in inches, and multiply that by your length in inches. Divide all of that by 144, and that'll give you your board feet. There are a lot of good board foot calculators either online, there are apps for the smartphone that'll make this a lot easier. But if you don't have the smartphone, or you're at the lumber yard trying to buy your lumber without a smartphone and a calculator, that's a quick way to do it. Remember, always bring your tape measure to the lumber yard so you can make sure you're getting enough lumber. I knew I was going to need a combination of 3/4 inch thick boards and 1/2 inch thick boards. So I decided to go with some 5/4 stock. Now, bear in mind that when you're choosing lumber and figuring up board footage, that's all in the rough state. So once everything's planed and cut down to length and surfaced on all four sides, you're going to have a little bit less wood than you would as rough sawn. But that's okay. That's a little bit less expensive that way, and it's not incredibly wasteful. So I headed to the lumber yard and I picked up my lumber and I brought it home, and it sat for about a week because I just didn't get a chance to get to it. And that's okay, because it's not a bad idea to, when you get your lumber home, to let it acclimate to the shop a little bit. That'll minimize any moving or cupping or warping or twisting or checking or any other such joyful things that wood tends to do. Since wood is kind of a quote unquote living thing, it does tend to move. It's really animated. So not a bad idea to let everything acclimate. Then once you get it acclimated, it's time to cut your parts to rough size. Now, when cutting your parts to rough size, I like to leave the length about 2 inches or so longer than what the length of the part that I need actually is. And I like to cut it with a circular saw. It just makes my life a little bit easier. Then when I go to rip it to rough width, I do that right at the bandsaw. I don't do it at the table saw because I always cut my rough dimensions before I mill the stock. It hasn't gone through the jointer or planer or anything, and if there are tensions inside of the piece of lumber, table saw could cause binding and kickback, and I don't really need to deal with any of that, and neither do you. So if you don't have a bandsaw, that's okay. You can use your circular saw, you can use a jigsaw, whatever you have to cut it down. I've even broken down lumber with a handsaw. That was a workout. But here's how I went about cutting everything to rough length and width. Well, as you saw, I had a little bit of trouble getting through it with my circular saw. Um, some battery powered circular saws are obviously going to be a little bit more powerful than others. The one I have is an inexpensive one, but I really didn't feel like running a lead cord. I was a bit lazy that particular day. So I grabbed my battery saw, killed one battery, changed the battery, and it worked a little bit better. But I would definitely recommend if all you have is an inexpensive battery powered circular saw, if you have a corded circ saw, go ahead and use that. Now it's on to the bandsaw. We're going to be cutting to rough width, and what I like to do is go about a half an inch over my width dimension for my part. So if I need a part that's about 4 inches wide, then I'll actually cut the width roughly at 4.5, and that gives me a little bit of room to play with in terms of edge jointing and getting everything squared up. So here's how I did that. After that, my parts were all cut to rough length and width, and now I needed to resaw some stock to get some thinner pieces to mill down to a half-inch finished thickness. And I'll do that right at the bandsaw, just like this. Well, that's how resawing goes. You just repeat that a few more times to get all your thin parts, and you're good to go. The reason I chose the 5/4 or inch and a quarter stock is because if I resaw it down the middle, it gives me pieces that are a little bit thicker than 5/8 of an inch, which makes it really easy to plane down to that half-inch final thickness. If I had to go from a 1 inch board or a 4/4 board, I really wouldn't be able to do that because at an inch thick, resawing down the middle is already going to be an eighth, or not an eighth, but half an inch, and it doesn't leave any room for planing. So that's why I went with the 5/4 boards. From there, it was off to the joiner for some face joining. Here's how that goes. So that's how face joining works. And you just, like the shampoo bottle says, rinse and repeat. Run all of your parts through until you have one face flat. and it may take multiple passes on each piece, but once you get a flat face, you're good to go over to the planer, which we'll talk about in a minute. But before we do that, I want to mention hearing protection. I know nobody wants to hear the lecture. I don't want to hear the lecture, but the fact is that even though on some tools you can kind of get away with not wearing it, you should probably wear it, and I should probably wear it when I'm working with all my power tools, but I don't. I always make sure I do with the joiner and planer just because they make such an amount of noise. Now, I had the video volume turned down on a lot of these shots just to show you the difference in volume. I'm gonna play one clip at full volume for you, and so you can judge for yourself. I never go without my hearing protection at the joiner and planer. Once all the parts are flat on one face, I could then take them to the joiner and square up one edge. Unfortunately, the footage of that either didn't get recorded or got lost. Either way, it's MIA somewhere. Uh, Edge joining is a pretty easy process. You just take your newly flattened face, hold that tight to the fence of your joiner, and then run the edge across the blades. So it's that simple. Once everything was edge jointed, I like to edge joint before I go to the planer just to finish everything up at the joiner before I move on to a different machine. Then you can go to the planer and run them through to get two parallel faces and mill them down to final thickness. And of course, you're going to be running the jointed edge down on the table of the planer, and it looks something like this. So that's how the planer operates. Once I had everything run through the planer, I had all my thicknesses down to 3/4 and 1/2 inch. The 3/4 for the carcass and shelves and dividers, top and bottom, and the 1/2 inch for the backboards, the face frame, and the door. One thing I did want to mention, if you notice, some of the pieces were coming through at an angle rather than square to the cutter head on the planer. I do that because I find that it helps to reduce snipe. So that's a little quick tip. What is snipe? Well, you have two rollers that feed the stock into the cutter head and the planer. And what happens is when only one of those rollers is engaging the stock, it tends to kick it up into the planer head, and the planer head will take a bigger bite when that happens and leaves a nice divot in your workpiece. So I find it minimizes that. At least it's a smaller section of the board that's being kicked up by the roller. And I've got a graphic that I'll put up here to illustrate that. You can see here as the board's fed in from the right hand side how it kicks up as the infeed roller grabs it and it engages the cutter head. You can also see as it continues through, it's going to be kicked back down by the outfeed roller, which is going to leave a little divot in the beginning edge of the board. And the same thing can happen at the trailing edge as the end comes off of the infeed roller and the outfeed roller kicks it up. So that's why I use the technique I do to minimize that. Well, everything's milled to final thickness and cut to rough length and width and ready to make parts from. And that'll be in part 2 coming up next. And if you like this video, don't forget to give me the thumbs up and leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. And if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. That way you don't miss part 2 and check out my other videos I have on the channel here. Thanks for watching.